All right, great. So welcome everybody. I'm Jason Lustig. I'm a Israel Institute teaching fellow at the Schusterman Center, and I'm tremendously pleased to to welcome our colleague Dr. Arnon Degani, who is joining us presently from Israel, and he will be speaking about the topic of what he calls Zionism's flip side: misconceptions in the debate over Israel-Palestine and settler-colonialism. Just to say a quick word about Dr. Degani, he is a historian of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, and he's currently working on a book about the integration of Arab citizens into Israeli society from 1948 until 1967, and he holds a Lady Davis Fellowship at the Harman Center for the Research on Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he is a research fellow at Malad, which I believe is a think tank. Am I correct? And so we are really pleased to have Arnon zoom in from halfway around the world and to share his insight into I think a really important but also very contentious topic where there's a lot to talk about. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here, and we're really looking forward to Arnon's presentation and having a chance to talk about it. So thank you.
Hello everyone. Thanks so much, Jason. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Seblin. Yeah. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be in virtually in Texas, in UT, Texas. I've known graduates from the university, and of course, Jason and I know each other from way back, and he's been a true friend, but also a colleague. And a lot of the ideas that came here, that will be raised here, are ideas that Jason saw their first draft, and I'd really be interested to hear what he'd have to say. So, without further ado, let's share. I'm admitting someone who just... Okay, let's start. So let's start with a quote from famous BDS activist and pro-Palestine notorious anti-Zionist Zev Jabotinsky. And the quote goes like this: "My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent." Now, the point here is not to get all excited about the fact that Jabu is using a word like colonizing. Yes, we all know that early Zionists did not find that word offensive, and at the time the word was not problematic. But I actually want to show you that Jabotinsky provides a great example of how to do settler-colonial analysis on Zionism. Jabotinsky, and this is a very important essay, The Iron Wall, explains the basic logic of what will become an entire movement within Zionism, and one can argue that this is the dominant movement today, revisionist Zionism. And he makes this argument by comparing Jews in Palestine to settlers in the American West and other settlers, and he compares the Palestinians to Indian, like the Sioux tribe, and other native populations throughout America. And he's doing this not to pass moral judgment on Zionism and not to portray the Palestinian Arabs as victims. By the way, that's how he referred to them, Palestinian Arabs. But to show that Zionism, he's doing this comparison to show that Zionism faces circumstances that are similar to other cases, other historical cases of settlement. And if we look at these other historical cases, we could understand Zionism's Zionism better. Now, this is how a robust analytical framework even works. It assumes that if there's similarity in one aspect between historical cases, and in this case, foreign settlement, people coming from the outside going in, it will be accompanied by other similarities, such as tenacious indigenous resistance to said settlement. And honestly, he's correct in that sense. And so because of the, so Jabotinsky stands before the rest of the Zionist movement and says, because the native structural tendency to resist foreign settlement, Jabotinsky calls upon the Zionist movement not to waste time by putting forward various power-sharing solutions with the Palestinian Arabs, because they see themselves as the sole proprietors of the land. And they will continue to see themselves this way until an iron wall is erected, until such point where they just give up, they realize we are not going anywhere. Now, of course, Jabotinsky did not consider Eretz Israel to be anything but entirely Jewish, right? And he also knew that, his own sense of Jewish ownership of Eretz Israel was irrelevant to understanding Zionism's objective historical circumstances. This lecture does the same. It starts without any value-ridden judgment on Zionism or Palestinians. It doesn't conclude who owns the land. It doesn't conclude who's really, really indigenous, who's biologically almost indigenous or essentially indigenous to the land, but it uses the settler-colonial framework to help us better understand certain events in Zionist history or the history of the conflict. Now, in this lecture, I will show you, and I claim that the advantage of applying a settler-colonialism framework to analyze Zionist history is that it helps, and this might sound paradoxical, and that it helps to explain liberal tendencies within Zionist thought and deed, right? Liberal aspects of Zionists that we can identify as liberal is, this is kind of familiar from what we know from the democratic or liberal democracy. Settler colonialism helps explain that. Yes, if anyone here who may be critical of Israel and Israeli society still thinks that it has aspects that they can identify with, that's because of settler colonialism, not in spite of settler colonialism. And so you might ask yourself, if that's the case, Degani, how come every anti-Zionist, anti-Israel activist out there, more or less, uses settler colonialism to bash Zionism? Well, here's the answer. Most scholars, intellectuals, and activists who use settler colonialism to bash Israel, ready? They don't know what they're talking about. They just don't, okay? The way they conceive of settler colonialism, the way settler colonialism animates their narratives on Israel, it's as if settler colonialism is a derivative of regular colonialism. It's a type of colonialism. Colonialism that has settlers in it, and it's not. And I can tell you that this is across the board, right? Just a recent book from Professor Rashid Khalidi, who I'm very much indebted to for his entire body of work, but his recent book is taking what he has masterfully shown us and applying settler colonialism on it. But the way he uses settler colonialism, it's as if it's colonialism with settlers, a type of colonialism, right? And here's the bigger problem, right? When scholars try to argue against the applicability of settler colonialism to Zionism, and they mostly do it out of a pro-Israel or kind of a Zionist sentiment, right? Even if they're, everyone's coming into this in good faith. I'm not saying that's not the case, but those that resist or deny the applicability of settler colonialism usually reinforce this misconception of the concept, because they analyze how Zionism is incompatible with settler colonialism while conceiving of settler colonialism like colonialism with settlers. And so we're left at the end of the day with a concept that really doesn't help us at all. So before I start explaining the advantages of understanding Zionist history as a settler colonial history, let's talk about settler colonialism and how it isn't colonialism. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that colonialism and settler colonialism are mutually exclusive, and there are indeed superficial similarities between them. They both involve an outsider force reaching an inhabited land, and not to join that society, not as immigrants, but to establish a new political order, which they incidentally tend to be the beneficiaries of. They dominate, right? But despite the similarities, and I cannot stress this enough, colonialism and settler colonialism are qualitatively different. The differences are apparent, for instance, in the way settler and settlers, and I'll use settlers instead of settler colonists, right? And colonists, and I'll use colonists instead of colonialists, relate to the place they came from, and the ways colonialists and settlers relate to the population they encounter, right? So if you look at settler colonialists compared to colonialists, they have a higher sense of distinct identity and right to a unique sovereignty from the place they just left. That's why it's silly to say that Zionism isn't settler colonialism, because there was no colonial empire backing it, right? It's more or less true that there wasn't a colonial empire backing it, if you understand the mandate as conditional help, right? But if people would just look at the theoretical literature of settler colonialism, they would see that tensions and even conflict between settlers and imperial rulers are what makes settler colonialism different from colonialism. So when we talk about settler colonialism, the better examples are the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And the reason I put, if you look on the right, you'll see Algeria and you'll see Kenya, right? And the reason I put them is because these are usually the cases that tend to confuse people. Because if you look at the colonists in Algeria and in Kenya, both of them were very much attached to the metropole. Their agenda in the country that they visited was as French or British citizens, right? They did not detach from the metropole. They did develop certain tensions, right? And in that sense, you can put them on a spectrum of settler coloniality. But at the end of the day, they did not detach. And then once the empire receded, they receded with it. But in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel, Palestine, the settlers did not extend the sovereignty of the place that they just arrived from. Okay, let's continue. Another way to phrase this point is that to look at the differences is that colonial relationships with the indigenous people are primarily premised on ongoing exploitation. The Senegalese, the Vietnamese, the Indians, they all work for the benefit of the empire. So the colonial empire needs indigenous people. It needs them to exist. But in settler colonial relationship, the indigenous people are not needed. Settlers are looking to entrench themselves, to hang on to the land, right? Land is the main objective here. So, if someone is in the way of settlers obtaining land, it's usually the settlers. So that they're redundant population, a redundant population. To not to be too blasé about it. So the relationship between settlers and indigenous is premised on erasure or elimination, right? They disappear to the point where the settlers themselves become the indigenous. They replace them. Now, when I say erasure or elimination, the first things that come to mind are genocide, disease, ethnic cleansing. All of that happened. Definitely happened in the U.S. Definitely happened in Canada, and versions of it also happened in Israel, Palestine. We all get that, right? And these things, but another aspect of erasure and elimination that's equally important and occurs and occurs simultaneously. It cannot be can be conceptually detached, but empirically cannot be. With violence of settler colonialism is assimilation, erasure through assimilation. Now, assimilation in the Jewish context is very, very has its own connotations. It means almost like the complete erasure of some sort of religious identity. But integration, absorption, there are different words depending on the material you're reading, but every one of them is under the title of assimilation, right? Now, how do you assimilate, right? So there's miscegenation, there's citizenship granting, appropriation of culture, apologies, etc., right? And I have here Elizabeth Warren, for instance, whose Native American ancestry is very it's not prominent, and yet a lot of white Americans have Native American ancestry, right? And so that is testament to a form of assimilation that occurred and still occurs in the 19th century. But we also, I mean, if you look at the haka dance that's happening there on the right in New Zealand, right? We have a European game, an Anglo game, Celtic game, I think its origins, right? And you see how an indigenous culture is kind of dressed upon that and making the national team indigenous, right? Or pretending to be indigenous. And we have other aspects, some of them offensive, some of them we find tasteful, like de Klerk and Desmond Tutu over there. But in any case, all of these happen as depopulation happens, sometimes at the same time. And I'll focus on one aspect of assimilation that's of course, assimilations are not smooth, but let's focus on granting citizenship. Though other forms of assimilation work in the same way. So why do settlers grant rights to indigenous people on a scale that colonists never do, right? So you know, the Vietnamese and the Algerians, they would never get like French citizenship just like that, right? But why do eventually, not always after there's a total depletion of numbers, like in the case of New Zealand, like in the case of Israel, why do settlers extend citizenship to indigenous populations? Now, they do so not because they are nice, but it ultimately facilitates making the indigenous people less of a problem. It makes them almost even less indigenous and more like us, right? And over here in the slide, right, I have a few points about what citizenship, for instance, does, right? Citizenship in itself is not a good category from which to demand privilege due to being there first, right? If you're fighting for your rights as a citizen, then the assumption is that if you're asking the state, if you're appealing to the state, you are not making yourself any special, right? I was here first. No, you are a citizen just like everyone else and deserve these rights. It provides a nonviolent avenues to pursue indigenous agenda, right? one doesn't need to, I mean, if you manage to form a coalition and move forward with demonstrations and grassroots, you can maybe change things instead of insurgency, right? And of course, once there's services like education, like health, commemoration, it increases the legitimacy of the settler state. It allows for a shared narrative and identity. This has not happened much in Israel, but to a certain extent, yeah. And citizenship rights dampen the poignant memory of the initial displacement and even land looting, right? Once, let's put that behind us. Maybe there's apologies like there are in Australia, like there were in Canada. Let's move forward. Now we're all citizens of this beautiful country. So, at the end of the day, indigenous people in all settler colonial cases, the successful ones, eventually they come to accept the settler state. In colonialism, which does not grant metropole citizenship to indigenous people, the natives usually create their own state. So to recap, Zionism fits with the settler colonial paradigm because the early Zionists left for Israel or Palestine without any intention to extend the rule of their homeland abroad, but to actually be part of some new project. They also did not come to exploit the indigenous population and siphon the products of their labor back to Poland or Russia or Germany. The Jews have had a millennia-long connection to Israel, to Eretz Israel. The Jews lived in this land prior to Zionism, right? There was a vibrant Jewish community, right? That was in the minority, but it was in certain cities, it was perhaps the majority or close to that. The persecution of Jews, the reason they were kicked out from where they were is kind of unique. It's different than different persecutions that led to settler movements like, maybe the Irish moving to the New World. It was much more intense, this hatred, this experience. I think there's something unique about anti-Semitism. But all of these make the Zionist case a unique case of settler colonialism. But every settler colonial case has its particularities. The question is, do the particularities essentially change the agenda of the settlers to make a country they just arrived to their new home? And I think in that sense, Zionism isn't different. Or does it matter to the indigenous people if the people that just recently came have some sort of rights, historical rights, emotional, cultural connection to the land? And it doesn't, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the objective of the settlers. It doesn't change the level of animosity or antagonism among the indigenous people. And that's what Jabotinsky understood. So now that I've clarified what I mean about Zionism being comparable to other settler colonial movements, let's see where that helps us better understand Zionist history. If we look at pre-1948 Zionism, we can see aspects of Zionist attempt to solidify their hold in Israel-Palestine by using, I would say, aggressive means. But on the other hand, we also see Zionists trying to accommodate Palestinian Arabs in their vision, either within the Ottoman framework or later within a binational state. Now, of course, I'm not the first one to discover that Zionism has these kind of more integrative aspects, right? That the Jewish state, as it was created in 1948, is almost entirely Jewish, was not the way the early Zionists envisioned things going. Mainly, they couldn't imagine this would happen. We have a lot of scholars that are working in this field. The most prominent one is Dmitry Shumsky with a very good book that came out in 2018, Beyond the Nation State. So I'm not discovering anything new about the prominence of non-statist solutions in Zionism, right? In the mainstream, I'm not talking about the Brit Shalom people. In the mainstream, we had these solutions, but I'm showing that these agendas are integral to Zionist logic of embedding Zionism, or embedding the issue, or embedding Jews as indigenous people. You have to offer a good deal to the indigenous people. If we move on, another chapter is just 1948 war, for instance. And now it's very easy to discern how the war was a typical settler-colonial movement, in the sense that the Zionist Yishuv entrenched itself in the land. It successfully separated from an imperial ruler, which is what happens in all other settler-colonial cases. Some completely break the tie, like the U.S. Some still, nominally remain within the empire's orbit, like Canada, like
Did we lose him?
I think he's frozen, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to send him a message.
Australia. Becomes are nominally, I would say, a part of Israeli society, and they take part. Can you hear me? Am I good? Okay. They take part in Israeli politics and in the process of the economy, and to a certain extent in the culture. And of course, recent years have seen interesting developments. So, Jason, I wonder how much time we have. What would be optimal?
We have about 30 minutes left, so I don't know how much more you have left in your presentation. I'm sure there's a lot of questions and comments. So,
I see. I'll just talk about my own work. Okay. So finally, the time period after 1948. Okay. That's where I found settler colonialism to be beneficial. This is where my doctoral dissertation is on, and my developing manuscript. So back in 2012, 10 years ago, settler colonialism was becoming the hot new word, and I wanted to see how this word fits with what I was obsessed with. And I was obsessed with the fact that Israel, throughout its lifespan, held a military regime over Arab civilians. And I thought perhaps settler colonialism can explain this fact, but maybe settler colonialism is the thing that's embedded in the Zionist brain and makes the Zionists kind of opt for these kinds of regime, right? It was a very early type of historical thinking. But if this was the case, okay, if Zionists can only govern non-Jews in a form of military government, and it sure seems like that came up in the last amnesty report, right? Then why was the military government progressively dismantled? Why was the first military government, and I have this animation to show the dark areas are the ones where Israel placed military government on the Palestinian Arab citizens, not the Palestinians in the territories in Israel, and it slowly deteriorated up until December '66. So when we're looking at the material, and I also encountered truly anti-military government and assimilationist rhetoric coming from prominent Zionists from the left and the right from 1948 and on, and even before, right? In public, people were saying this in public and behind closed doors. And all of them demanded more rights for Arabs, more and more Arab integration into Israeli society. And so at that point, UCLA has a visiting scholar by the name of Lorenzo Veracini, and he's a big guy in settler colonial studies. And we befriended each other. And really, that's the coincidence of research times, right? And after sitting for hours with him, trying to understand how settler colonialism fits with the dismantling of the gradual dismantling of the military government, he said the words, and I'll never forget this in his like Italian Australian accent. He said, Israel did not dismantle the military government in spite of settler colonialism. It dismantled it because of settler colonialism. And that was my aha moment, right? Up until now, explanations for why the military government was dismantled were all found in reasons external to Zionism, right? The big one was that it was a result of diplomatic pressure on Israel, right? Others kind of pointed to a liberal bent in Zionism, like liberal aspects of Jewish thought, liberal histories or historical lessons that Zionists carried, but not part of their Zionism. But in reality, what dismantled the military government and gave actual meaning to the citizenship of the Arabs in Israel was Zionism itself. It was something from within Zionism. And I'm not suggesting that Israeli officials who prescribed integration followed kind of a cynical manual, right? Like, oh, how to settler colonize for dummies, right? It wasn't as if they knew exactly what type of history they were following, even though some are more perceptive than others, right? But I have shown that Zionist leadership positions in the clerk class, in bureaucrats, even in the military, they all believe that Palestinian Arabs in Israel, that the citizens, they are a threat to the state. They are a threat to the Zionist project. But the way to deal with this threat is equalizing their political status, integrating them into all walks of life, providing them with decent government services, and lifting the humiliating security measures, if you can call them those, that were placed on them. And there's ample evidence that all Zionist parties shared this approach. But if you look at Zionism as colonialism, right? If Zionism is just a type of colonialism, or Zionism is ethnonationalism or nationalism, it makes it difficult to consider these sentiments as authentically Zionist. It has to be some sort of appendix to someone's Zionism, right? If anyone wants to claim that this is a Zionist apologia, I'll say I'm not trying to paint a pretty picture here. At no time in history can anyone ever claim Israel treated its Arab citizens as equals, right? I would not have liked to be born an Arab in Israel, not then and not today. But from the other side, Arabs in Israel were also never too thrilled to be within, in the orbit of Zionism. But what I am saying that by the year 1967, Israel successfully turned a part of the Palestinian nation from an existential threat to an internal group, which largely decided to fight for equality by using democratic and nonviolent means. The Arabs in Israel recognized the authority of the Jewish state, if not the identity of Jewish state, and they recognize its institutions by large. And in general, when indigenous people voice their grievances and further their agenda in the language of liberal democracy, then you probably have a successful settler colonial project on your hands. And let's just say, I'll skip the examples, but I can show them of Zionist leaders pointing to the fact that the military government is in the way of integrating the Palestinian Arab citizens. I'll skip to the slide I have. These are all quotes from prominent if you look after 1967, right, when Israel expands its borders, it doesn't ethnically cleanse or transfer. There were 200,000 refugees from the West Bank that indeed left, but it wasn't and at least on the same. It wasn't 80% of the West Bank's population, right? And so there's in Gaza, not to mention Gaza. So Israel did not depopulate the territories. It did depopulate the Golan Heights, but that's a different story now. But it also did not it did not grant citizenship. It did integrate Palestinians into the economy as cheap labor, right? And so the relationship between Israel and the territories suddenly became more colonial, classically colonial. It's premised on exploitation. That doesn't eliminate the natives, not by kicking them out and not by absorbing them in, right? And there's also settlement in the territories, right? Oh, so there's settler-colonialism. Now there is, right? But interestingly enough, if you look at the settlers leaving Kfar Saba or Tel Aviv or West Jerusalem to the West Bank, they carry upon themselves the Israeli flag. They are not doing this in the name of a new type of sovereign. In the very kind of edges, in the very kind of periphery of this phenomenon, there are those that are talking about Medinat Yehuda, the state of Judea that's separate, kind of like a Texas esprit de corps. But in general, these are more like Algeria or Kenya rather than the pioneers of the American West. And I'll end here. There's more content I can point to, but maybe that'll come up in the answers and questions and answers. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnon. That was phenomenally interesting. And there's so much to say. There are already a whole bunch of questions that are coming in from the chat. I will kind of hold back. I have a bunch of things I could say, but maybe we can collect some questions from the chat. Avi wrote in the chat, how does the fact of expulsion, I'll just give a couple of them and then you can respond to them sort of briefly.
Okay.
How does the fact of expulsion fit into this understanding? How does expulsion equal integration? And is the Zionism of far-right politicians who call for total expulsion today something other than settler colonialism? I'm just reading these in order. And then Alan wrote in the chat, more of a comment than the question, that he has an Israeli Jewish colleague who says that, active in civil society, who says that full integration of the Bedouin is the next frontier of Zionism. And then I'll give a third one, and then we can kind of pause there for a second. Elijah asks that when historical solutions from a partition to the contemporary are proposed, there has typically been a notion of either economic union or a program built between the two populations. How does the settler colonialism frame explain the existence of such proposals? And I think the common thread between these questions really is about, to what extent does the settler colonialism model that you're proposing is the best fit to explain the overall situation? Like, how do you fit kind of the edge cases, as it were, right, into that discussion? How do you fit the different things that are all happening under that umbrella?
It's very, how does expulsion work with assimilation? That was the first question.
Yeah, you can see them also in the chat.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, they're both forms of elimination, right? One is much more palatable to us, right? One is something that we don't find repugnant. You probably don't find repugnant or as repugnant because you live in a country that perpetrated that. They work in the same way. they make the indigenous people less indigenous, or so either they're not there, or they are indistinguishable from the settlers. It's the part that's hard to get from my lecture. It's the part that's counterintuitive. Settler colonialism doesn't sound like it's something that could that has something we can even support. But there you go. I mean, extending citizenship is definitely allows one to reach similar consolidation of settler project as forceful removal or even physical liquidation. I'm sorry, I only caught the last question, maybe a question about solutions, right? So across the board, if you look at solutions, all of them are settler colonial to a certain extent. If you're looking at one state that's one Jewish state, right? This is like Smotrich or like the religious right. Their idea is, okay, we take control of the entire land. All the Palestinians that are willing to be faithful and loyal to the Israeli state, we'll keep them. All those that are not, we'll kick them out. Probably no one will probably be that excited about living in a country that sentences you to subordination. So most of them will probably rebel, and we'll kick out most of them, and we'll finish the job of 48. Right? We understand how that's settler colonialism. That's easy. Two-state solution, another form of settler colonialism. But how come? Well, in that form, you eliminate the natives, right? But you don't do it by physically removing them. You don't do it by absorbing them. You do it by redrawing your borders in a way that most are outside of them. And I think with the Gaza Strip, that worked rather well. Not to say that this engagement worked rather well, but to say that from a settler colonial perspective, the people in Gaza, though they are not silent and there's belligerency between them, but you can say that the idea of them being absorbed into Israel is more and more seemingly impossible, right? They have been eliminated, you could say, from the Israeli population equation, whereas the population in the West Bank, that remains to be seen. And then, of course, there's the one-state solution that's democratic, right? And that is also a form of settler colonial solution. It happened in South Africa, right? But the thing to notice is that it only happened after the indigenous people were willing to say that South Africa belongs to the whites also, right? That this is their home as well, that they are as indigenous as we are. This was the banner of the ANC, right? In Israel-Palestine politics today, those that are advocating for one state, they usually don't talk about what would be the rights of Jewish people. Will they be, citizens of this? Well, they'll be maybe citizens of, but will the country treat them as if that they are their sons and daughters of the land, right? And the last amnesty report, for instance, doesn't mention that, or the BDS agenda doesn't mention what will be the rights of the Jews. But maybe if a one-state movement coalesces around principles similar to the ANC, then the success of such a struggle would be the consolidation of a settler colonial movement, because the Jews will have become indigenous to the land because the indigenous people say they are. Okay, and I hope most people got it, but if not, you can email me and I'll answer that. I'm sorry, I kind of where there's more questions, or
yeah, but why don't we open it up kind of for more questions if people want to raise their hand. If somebody wants to ask a question, you know, like maybe somebody who wrote something in the chat who wants to pose something for Arnon. I'm sure there's a lot of questions here, you know, specifically about the usage of the term settler-colonialism. And Mia, why don't you get us started?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So I'll be honest, I'm definitely like really new to this conversation, so it's been really interesting to hear what you've been sharing. And I was wondering if you could help me understand like how this framework fits in to the conversation on Israel-Palestine, and like what this framework does for the overarching theme. I know that's really broad, but I'm just like, I'm interested, and I really want to understand what you're trying to present here today. So thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I think I get what you're trying to ask me, and I'll explain. When people put Zionism within a settler-colonial framework, when they talk about Zionism being settler-colonial, a lot of them think they are putting it in the Algerian example. People that came from the outside retained their privileges, subordinated the indigenous population, exploited their labor, created a regime that is hierarchical, and the main kind of aspect, the core of this regime was either you're French or you're Muslim, Arab, or Berber, right? That was the kind of dichotomy, right? So they think they're putting Israel and Zionism into that narrative, and I think there's some aspiration that following that narrative, the Zionists will leave. I think, right? At least for some people, that's the case. But in fact, you know, they're putting Israel and Palestine, and they're putting the Zionists in a narrative where they stay, where they eventually stay, and they usually thrive, right? And so to say that Zionism is illegitimate because it's settler-colonial, I don't mind people saying that, right? I don't mind, you know, and I understand that this has to do with the ingrained anti-humanity of it, which exists. But I would also say that saying that from a university campus on the American West Coast is somewhat problematic, right? So I'm not suggesting that Zionism is beyond criticism. It is. I think settler colonialism is a critical perspective of understanding Zionism, not as some sort of outgrowth, natural outgrowth of Judaism, but as a part of world history, right? Good and bad. But I don't think that it is a good platform to argue for its complete illegitimacy. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think I was trying to understand like if settler colonialism is used as like a categorization in terms of conversation, or if it's used as a criticism, but you answered my question, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important set of issues, just thinking about like how the theory, right? You know, you're talking about sort of like, you know, the use of sort of academic theory, like how that relates to practical issues of the conflict, especially when the terms are being thrown around, right? You know, so like Arnon, I'm just going to jump in here with a question, so like, you know, just to kind of build off of Mia's question here, which is that like, you know, Arnon, you're talking a lot about sort of how people use the term wrong, right? Essentially, colonialism and settler colonialism, but like, you know, to what extent is that like a cry into the void when, you know, activists, you know, as well as scholars, as you kind of suggest, are kind of using the term in their own way, like, you know, anyway,
What I can say is that I wish that I had the authority to change the word. I wish I could call it settlerism or call it Deganiism or whatever. I don't know. But no, it's a problem. I am not usually. I am usually embraced, or it's like I've been embraced very uncritically by a certain academic crowd. And once people understood what I was writing about, they were not happy. I mean, another example would be that an article that I'm publishing that kind of that mirrors this lecture, for instance, had two reviewers. One was accusing me of being a Zionist apologetic, doing Zionist propaganda, and the other one accused me of being an anti-Zionist charlatan. Honest to God, like one review said that, the other said that. I have my own views about Zionism. I have my own identity, but I honestly don't see. I honestly try to approach this as a framework that can help us better understand what happened and give better explanations rather than just some sort of essentialism of what Zionism is, right? Except that it's settler-colonialism.
We have still a few more minutes left. I imagine that there are some more questions. Does anybody sort of want to jump in? Question for Arnon?
Hey, I have a quick question. And it's just back to the definition. What's the definition of occupation and colonism? Like, what are the difference?
Occupation and colonialization?
Yeah.
I don't know. Within the analytical world of literature, that these like colonization is some sort of outward force, right? Inserting itself into a new land, right? Some people use the Z in colonization, right, instead of colonialism, to kind of point out that there are people that are coming to live there, if not permanently, but at least, you know, for a while. This would be maybe a way to describe Algeria as a case of colonization, right? And occupation has, you know, has legal interpretations of what it means when an army, you know, when a state wins a war and gets controlled, and it has to occupy it has to start some, it has to enact some sort of occupation regime. That's international law. And usually occupation means that you are not giving citizenship and you are not annexing that area. You're not saying that's an integral part of my country. No, this is the country. This area is kind of disputed. So it overlaps. It definitely is relevant to what happens in Israel. All these. I would say Israel is occupying the West Bank and colonizing it rather than settler colonizing, maybe.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. It was a good one.
Yeah. We have still a few more minutes. Are there further questions? I also can jump in, but I want to give, you know, especially students a chance to ask questions.
Is there something that was completely I'll ask, was there something that was completely opaque for you, that something that you just didn't get? Sounds good.
Maybe I have a just quick one note. I don't know, like, is the topic like colonization is a good thing or a bad thing? Do we have an answer for that, or just no answer?
Historians don't don't go into that. I mean, it's a bad
We can
thing.
judge.
It's a bad thing. I mean, if the fundamentals of the humanities, take the humanity as being inseparable whole, right? If that's your starting point, and the idea of placing people under some sort of coercive regime, one that assumes that they are inferior, that can't be good, right? But it's part, but it did. There is no buts. It's not good, but it also can be analyzed of how does this type of regime, colonialism or settler colonialism, works, right? How does it consolidate? How does it, where does it draw its legitimacy from? And in settler colonialism, which is also, I wouldn't say it's good, right? In settler colonialism, the dissipation of privilege, the equalizing of political status is actually part of the process, whereas in colonialism, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, like, if I could just add something on top of that, kind of, right? So it's like, so it's kind of like two things together. So the first one, so you're kind of saying that, like, on the one hand, like, scholars tend not to judge. That's like not our role as scholars, right? But also, like,
right.
there is no equation in which colonialism is good, right? You look at especially the sum of human history, not just Israel and Palestine, but just in general, colonialism has been, a tremendously devastating phenomenon of global human history, right?
Devastating for one, and very, very, very beneficial for other parts of the world. Can't deny that.
Yes, well, okay, but my point is that, so you wrote an article, I don't mean to drag things out that you wrote in the past, but like you wrote an article in Haaretz like last year, I want to say, right? About how, like, maybe it was before, I can't remember when you published it. COVID, there's no more sense of time, right?
Right.
But like about how, like, Israel is a settler-colonial society, and that's okay, right? And I think that the gist of what you were saying in that article, if I recall correctly, was not that it's okay that Israel is a settler-colonial society, but that it's not inherently a slur to call a country or a society settler colonial, because America is a settler colonial project. Canada, Australia, these are all settler colonial projects, and these are all highly successful states, right? So I think that, like, part of what is happening is that when you see, like, activists, on both sides kind of throwing around this terminology, they are using the terms as a way to pass a judgment, as opposed to an analytical framework to think about it.
Well, the more sophisticated scholars would find what you say to be insulting, right? Usually, if Rashid Khalidi is not trying to, Rashid Khalidi in his work kind of understands that if he's saying that Israel is a settler colonial state, he's putting it on par with the U.S. I mean, there's different shades of misunderstanding what settler colonialism is, but we live in a liberal order, right? And maybe it's deteriorating. I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine right now. I don't know the fate of American empire, but we're still in the liberal order. And in the liberal order, it's not good to have, it's not moral to have one group be politically superior from another, all right? But to have a group that enjoys the privileges of the past while it endows the same political rights to the people of lower classes, then it seems fine, right? And so settler colonialism is actually not against international law, while colonialism is. And so whether law corresponds to justice, that's not always the case. I'm not answering a question here, but I'm trying to kind of develop what you're just saying. And I think that indeed indeed there's a blind spot to trying to use it as a way to pass judgment on Israel, on Zionism.
Well, I think we're like basically out of time, but if you have time for one more question,
last
what
question.
I will just kind of ask you to push you here on, right, to kind of
Okay.
finish this up here, is like, so you're saying that that in the world liberal order, so to speak, dominated by the United States, and like, however that may be changing, perhaps the terminology of settler colonialism is not as damaging, right? Because America itself is settler colonial, right?
Yeah.
And then part of the question here then is, how do you sort of move from this analytical framework towards having some kind of resolution, right? Like, in what ways does the fact of identifying the state of Israel and its projects, both its exclusionary ones and also the attempt to sort of include Palestinian citizens and so on, right, as all being settler colonial, does that then lead to any potential for resolution, like through the analytical framework, or does that lead us to throw our hands up in the air and say, well, everything is settler colonial, no matter how you spin it?
I would like Israel to lean into settler colonialism, but the type of settler colonialism which is, not violent, right? And if I see any kind of political potential, right? I don't go around, waving, let's all be settler colonialists, right? I'm not doing that. But as an Israeli, I'm trying to point out that the integration and the citizenship of the Arabs in Israel is as Zionist as settling in the West Bank, right? As settling, and we have to just figure out. I'm not denying I'm not saying that I'm the real Zionist and the settlers in the West Bank are not, right? I'm saying we're both Zionists. But let's think about what kind of country we'll have when their values are the dominant ones, or do you prefer a country that has values that are entrenched in equality, in inequality? Let's just say that. And does it mean the evisceration of Israeli Jewish identity? I don't think so. It definitely doesn't. It definitely does not adhere to what a Jewish state means for the settlers. But I honestly think that that at the same time, a crazy right winger could look at what I'm saying. Oh, if dominating the Palestinians in the West Bank is really not an effective way to get rid of them, let's just get rid of them. That could also be the case. So I'm not sure that it advocates any one solution. That advocates, in fact, many. It could point that many solutions are possible. I definitely would like to choose the one that has democracy in mind. I think a solution was used.
I mean, I think we're both out of time, but I just want to say thank you again, Arnon, for joining us, from all the way around the world and sharing your insight here into how we can critically analyze, what's been going on historically as well as today, and understand sort of the functional nature of how the Zionist project in the state of Israel has developed over time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason and Jonathan.